Okay, welcome to our Thursday night New York Giants Preservation Society meeting with Bruce Markusen. Today is November 2nd. Hope everybody had a happy Halloween. Bruce is going to be discussing his book about Orlando Cepeda, the Orlando Cepeda story. Orlando Cepeda, Bruce, I'm sure will tell you, was originally drafted by the New York Giants. Bruce will go into discussion about him. Let me just give you some updates on what's going to be occurring in the next few weeks. Next week on November 11th, we have Lincoln Mitchell talking about his brand new book, The 100 Most Important Players in Major League Baseball History. And then on November 16th, we have Paul Rogers, who's going to be talking about New York Giant pitcher Larry Jansen. The following week, we will celebrate Thanksgiving without having a meeting. So I would love to turn the program over to Bruce Markusen. Bruce, if you don't know, is a mainstay up in Cooperstown. I put a podcast of him and Dan Taylor on our channel. One of those early discussions that we had that I didn't know what I was doing. We didn't record it, and it was on Dan's book, so one of Dan's many books. So without any further ado, Bruce, welcome to the New York Giants Preservation Society. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, and good evening to everybody else. Thanks for taking time out of a Thursday evening to join me. Very glad to be with you, talking about one of my favorite people in baseball, Orlando Cepeda. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. You should see the image of my book cover and Orlando's 1968 and 1970 Topps cards. So I want to begin the presentation by going into Orlando's ancestry and talking a little bit about his father. His father was Markusen Cepeda. He was a legendary shortstop who played in leagues in Puerto Rico, where he was from, where obviously Orlando was from. Also, Markusen played in the Dominican Republic. He was a guy that had several offers, many offers, to play in the Negro Leagues. But he did not want to do that because he didn't want to have to deal with the Jim Crow segregation of the United States at the time. So he preferred playing in Latin America, played Winter League, easily had the talent to play in the Negro Leagues. And certainly if there was no color barrier, he would have been able to play in the major leagues as well. I've talked to Orlando a few times about his father, and Orlando is always very humble. And he always says that his father was a much better ball player than he was. And of course, Orlando, Hall of Fame first baseman. But he really was proud of his father and his father's ability. He was a shortstop who could field, who could hit. He was just a phenomenal talent. And Orlando has no doubt that under different circumstances, his father would have prospered either in the Negro Leagues or, again, if it weren't for the color line, would have done extremely well in the major leagues. Orlando himself was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico. When he was young, his family moved around quite a bit, but eventually settled in Santurce. And just as a matter of coincidence, Santurce happens to be the first professional team Roberto Clemente ever played for in the Puerto Rican Winter League. And if we can extend that coincidence a little further, Santurce also happens to be the city that my mother was born in. A lot of people don't know that I'm Puerto Rican on my mother's side. I was born in the New York City area, but my mother was born in Santurce. She lived in Puerto Rico when she was younger. And when my grandmother divorced my grandfather, she and my mother essentially fled Puerto Rico. My grandfather was from everything I've been told, he was a very powerful, wealthy man, but he was not the nicest person, and he could make life very difficult for my grandmother and my mother. So they actually fled Santurce, and they came to New York City, and that's where my mother and grandmother basically lived in that area for the rest of their lives. Getting back to Orlando, he grew up very much in poverty in Puerto Rico. He was surrounded by a lot of crime, a lot of drug use. Unfortunately, as a youngster, he himself became involved with drugs, and this was a problem that would persist in later life, as we'll talk about. A lot of you may know that Orlando had some severe legal trouble that he got into when he was found with marijuana back in the mid 1970s. We'll talk more about that as we proceed. From a very young age, Orlando loved baseball, played the game, but he also loved playing basketball as a teenager. And it was while playing basketball that he suffered his first knee injury, the first of many knee injuries. It's interesting because his father, Perucho, wanted Orlando to be a baseball player. And at one point, must have been sometime after this injury happened, Perucho said to Orlando, "Enough with basketball, you're a baseball player." And he sort of steered Orlando in that direction. And based on what Orlando has said, his father was very tough on him. If he had a bad day, if Orlando did not play well in whatever youth league he was playing, his father would really let him have it. So he was very tough, very demanding, and some might say that's a little bit unfair on the part of the father, but Orlando actually has said that it probably did make him a better player in the long run. So as he was playing basketball, before his father banned that, he suffers this knee injury. And then while he's recovering from the knee injury, he actually put on more than 40 pounds of weight. And he also happened to grow several inches in height. So he became a lot bigger and stronger. And in a lot of ways, that really played into his baseball career. Now, Orlando eventually did draw interest from professional scouts. 1953, he was scouted by a man named Pedrin Zodia, who owned a winter league team in Puerto Rico, the Santurce Crabbers, Puerto Rican Winter League club. So that was 53, and Zodia really took notice of Cepeda. The following year, Zodia arranged for Cepeda to have a tryout with the New York Giants. Zodia had connections with the Giants. So a tryout was held in Melbourne, Florida. And Cepeda did very well at the tryout, really impressed the Giants. They offered him a contract, and that included a bonus of $500, which at the time, 1954, pretty decent money. And again, for a youngster like Orlando coming from a poor background, $500 must have seemed like a fortune. Now, the Giants, after signing him, they assigned him to Salem of the Appalachian League, and he struggled. And one of the reasons that he struggled is just before his professional career began in Salem, his father died from malaria. His father was not very old. He was 49. And this obviously affected Orlando. He didn't play well. We think his father's death was a factor there. And he's actually released in the middle of his first season by Salem. So here you think of a young prospect released during his first minor league season, lower level minor leagues. And you think eventually this is a guy who makes the Hall of Fame. It's a pretty remarkable story. So he was out of work for a little bit, excuse me. And then he signed with another Giants farm team. They decided to sign him to another club, Kokomo, Indiana. And there, he really thrived as a player. Batted nearly 400 for Kokomo. Excuse me a moment. So after that bad start with Salem, he really starts to find himself in Kokomo and starts to give some indication of this talent that he has. The following year, the Giants move him up to the Northern League. And there he plays incredibly well. In fact, he wins the Triple Crown, leads the league, batting average, home runs, RBIs, and really progresses steadily through the Giants farm system. So recovers very nicely after that rough first summer in Salem. By 1958, when the Giants had moved from New York to San Francisco, well, he's able to find a place on their opening day roster. Some factors helped him. Bill White, who was with the Giants at the time, was still serving a stint in the U.S. Army. And the Giants were not completely satisfied with Whitey Lockman at first base. So they kept an open mind, and they looked at Orlando that spring, and he impressed them. And he actually won the first base job. So that first year that the Giants are in San Francisco, Orlando becomes a regular, really becomes a star. He hits 312, hits 25 home runs, and he takes home National League Rookie of the Year honors. So pretty amazing. Only 4 years after making his pro debut, he's in the major leagues, he's Rookie of the Year. Orlando became extremely popular in San Francisco, where he became known as the Baby Bull. He, of course, had never played for the franchise while they were in New York. He had signed with them when they were the New York Giants, but he'd only played in the minor leagues. So when he debuted, it coincided with the San Francisco move, and the San Fran fans really took to him as one of their own. Fortunately, we lost our screen sharing here. Let me see if I can bring that back. In just a moment. I'm not sure what happened there. Let's see if I can bring that up. All right, should be back in just a second here. Okay, there we go. So the San Francisco fans really consider him kind of their homegrown star. And in some ways, he becomes even more popular than Willie Mays, because some of the San Francisco fans kind of felt that Willie was the New York star who had transferred to the other coast. It's kind of weird to think of that, given how popular Willie Mays has become over time in Giants history. But in the late 1950s, Orlando was really the guy on the Giants that drew the biggest following from the fans, or at least one of the biggest followings. And Orlando really loved San Francisco too. He loved the city. He loved the nightlife. There were clubs that played the kind of music that he liked, that he would go to. So it was really a perfect marriage between Orlando and the city of San Francisco. So 1958 goes very well. He wins Rookie of the Year. But then 1959, the situation becomes complicated because a young player named Willie McCovey arrives. Now, McCovey, of course, also a first baseman. So the Giants manager, Bill Wrigley, has kind of a difficult situation. He has two extraordinarily talented young first basemen. Of course, there's no DH. That's years and years away. And he has to make a decision who to put in first base and who to maybe put in left field. Ultimately, Wrigley decides, I'm going to put McCovey at first. Cepeda was probably faster, definitely faster, a little more athletic, seemed like a better fit for left field. But Orlando didn't have much experience playing the outfield. He was quoted as saying that he was not ready mentally to play the outfield. And he really expressed a reluctance to play there. So it was an awkward situation. They had to get both bats in the lineup somehow. Wrigley felt this was the best solution. And really, on paper, it did make sense because Cepeda was the better athlete and was faster. but Orlando was not comfortable out there. Ultimately, in 1962, 3 years later, Cepeda would return to first base. McCovey would move to left field. But the difficulty in managing this Cepeda-McCovey conundrum, 2 players for 1 position, would linger for the organization. It would remain a problem for Rigney and the managers that followed. Now, Cepeda, in the meantime, is having great seasons, despite the fact that he's not always happy playing the outfield. Great years, 1961 and 62. But then the relationship with his new Giants manager becomes a real sore point, and that manager was Alvin Dark. And I talked to Orlando. First time I met Orlando was probably about 20 years ago, and I remember asking him about Alvin Dark. And there was no doubt in his mind that Alvin Dark was somebody who had racist attitudes. Orlando felt that Dark did not like Black players or Latino players in particular. He talked about Dark trying to ban the Latino players from speaking Spanish in the clubhouse. Orlando said that actually did happen. When the Spanish players in the Giants clubhouse spoke to each other, and they would speak in Spanish, their first language, Dark didn't like that. He didn't, I guess, trust the players. He wasn't sure what they were saying. Maybe they were talking behind his back. He kind of became paranoid about it. That's what led him to try to ban the speaking of Spanish in the Giant clubhouse. And that obviously did not go over well with the Latino players. Dark also felt that Cepeda, as talented as he was and as good a hitter as he was, he felt Orlando did not always hustle. He felt there were times where Orlando just didn't give a full effort. Orlando would always argue that it wasn't that, it was simply a case of his knees bothering him. His knees were a chronic problem that would only get worse. Eventually, Alvin Dark leaves. Herman Franks comes in as manager. And he was another manager that also felt that Cepeda did not always hustle. Franks also made the decision to move Cepeda back to the outfield. So there were problems there. So Orlando generally got along well with Bill Rigney. There was some tension there, but in retrospect, Orlando has said Rigney was maybe the best manager he ever had. But Orlando did not really like Alvin Dark, didn't really like Herman Franks, lots of problems. By May of 1966, it's kind of obvious the Giants need to do something about the situation. And they decide to resolve it by making a trade. And it turned out to be a very bad trade. They sent Cepeda to the Cardinals for a left-hand pitcher, Ray Sadecki. Now, Sadecki was a very good pitcher, but he had really seen his best years, and he was a good pitcher, but he was being traded for a great hitter, an MVP type player. And in retrospect, it did not work out well for the Giants. It was not a good trade. But in the meantime, it was a perfect fit for the St. Louis Cardinals. They needed a first baseman. They needed a power hitter. Orlando filled the bill on both counts. And he was very much welcomed in the St. Louis clubhouse. He got along very well with manager Red Schoendienst. Red was known as really a player's manager, someone who communicated well with his players. Orlando felt comfortable in that clubhouse. He played Latino and jazz music in the clubhouse, and that's where he earned the nickname of Cha-Cha because of the music that he played. And he did become popular with his teammates, not just the Latino players, but also the white players and the African-American players. So once Orlando goes to St. Louis, his play actually improves. He's able to play first base. But then in 1967, that's where he really blossoms. He hits .325 with 25 home runs, and he wins the MVP award in convincing fashion. In fact, he wins it unanimously while leading the Cardinals to the pennant. So that was in a lot of ways a breakthrough season for Orlando. He'd already established himself as a star, but he kind of took it to a next level in 67. The Cardinals would win another pennant in 1968, but Orlando struggled. He had some injury problems. His hitting was not as good. He hoped that he was going to be able to come back and have a better year in 1969. And then kind of out of nowhere, came the news during spring training that the Cardinals had made a blockbuster trade. And it was a 1-for-1 deal. They sent Cepeda to the Atlanta Braves for Joe Torre. And it really caught everybody by surprise. Orlando was certainly not happy with the trade, and he wondered why the Cardinals had done it. You know, he'd been so good in 66 and 67, and then he had the one-off year in 68, and he kind of felt like, why are the Cardinals giving up on me so quickly? He loved playing for St. Louis. He got along well with the other guys, and he was really upset by the trade. He was also leery of going to the Braves, playing for a team in the South, where we know life would be very difficult for Black and Latino players. So in 1969, struggling to adjust to his new team, Orlando does not have a particularly good year, but then he bounces back with a very good season in 1970. One of the players he really became close friends with was Felipe Alou, a great outfielder from the Dominican Republic. And I think that friendship helped him become more comfortable in Atlanta. 1971 begins, and Orlando picks up where he left off in 1970. He gets off to a great start, but then early in the season, he hurts his knee, his left knee. It basically collapsed under him. It wasn't while he was playing. This, I think, was at home. He was just doing something kind of routine in his apartment, and out of nowhere, his left knee just gave in, and he had to have surgery. So his season comes to an end in July, and then in September, surgery takes place. I'm not sure why they waited so long, but he had surgery late in the year. He then tries to rehab from the injury. He comes back to the Braves in the spring of 72, but it's obvious he's still struggling with the knee. It's not 100%. He's not 100% recovered. He hits poorly to start the season, and basically the Braves felt that he was done. They felt that he was over the hill. I believe at that point, Orlando was about 31-32, and they just felt his best days were way behind him. So at the end of June, they made another interesting trade. It would have been a blockbuster trade if it happened about 4 years earlier, because it involved another guy who had been a great player in the 1960s, and that was Denny McLain. So the Braves end up trading Cepeda to the Oakland A's, 1-for-1 deal for Denny McLain. And it was an interesting trade in that both players had obviously fallen on hard times. The two teams felt maybe a change of scenery. The A's were looking for a platoon first baseman. The Braves were looking for starting pitching. So that's the deal that ended up happening. But as it turned out, McLain was pretty much done, would have no impact in Atlanta. And Orlando would hardly play for the A's. Now, he would resurrect his career later, but he did very little with the A's. In fact, in that 72 season, he came to bat only 3 times as a pinch hitter. His knees were not that strong. He really couldn't play first base. And this was, of course, a season before the DH rule. So that was not an option. So they used him as a DH, or as a pinch hitter, I should say. He appeared in 3 games, went 0 for 3. And at that point, he felt like he couldn't play. So he shut himself down for the rest of the year. And that was probably really tough on him, because that was the year the A's would win the first of 3 world championships. So here Orlando is arriving in the Bay Area. The A's are on the cusp of winning the World Series. And he's on the sidelines. He's not even suiting up. He's not traveling with the team. He's not with them during the championship series of the World Series. I mean, technically, he was still under contract to the A's, but he was really a member of the team in name only. Much like the Braves had surmised earlier, the A's, their owner, Charlie Finley, they felt he was done. They didn't feel he could play anymore. They should have had a little more foresight with the DH rule coming into play very shortly, but Finley gave him his release. Both of his knees were in pretty bad shape. He was really unable to play first base. It seemed like his career was over. But then, as I said, the DH rule is adopted that winter. And this is going to give Cepeda another chance. Boston Red Sox, looking for somebody to fill that new DH role, they sign him to a contract. He reports to spring training. His knees feel a little bit better after a winter rest. He becomes the Red Sox regular DH. He hits 289 with 20 home runs, I should say, and really becomes the most productive DH in the American League in that first season of the new rule. So he does really well. Even though he can't play first, he doesn't run very well, he can still swing the bat. And he has a good season for the Red Sox. So he comes to spring training the following year. Everybody figures, including Orlando, that he's going to be the DH for a second season. And then in the middle of spring training, Red Sox, who have a new manager, Darryl Johnson, surprise everybody. Johnson releases two veteran players, Luis Aparicio, the Hall of Fame shortstop, and Cepeda. And this was a shocking move given how well Cepeda had played in 1973. Cepeda felt that Johnson didn't like him for whatever reason. So after this very productive season in Boston, Orlando is out of a job. One team showed interest, the Kansas City Royals, but they weren't convinced enough to offer him a contract. So Orlando ends up going to the Mexican League to start the season, essentially playing double-A ball, basically the equivalent Mexican League, probably about double-A at that point. And then after playing for the Yucatan franchise, he does again draw some interest from the Royals. The Royals changed their general managers in mid-season. The new GM, Joe Burke, decided we could use Cepeda. We need a power hitter. We're a team that's very dependent on singles hitting and runs scored, so base running, I should say. So they end up signing Orlando in the middle of the summer. Now, in some ways, it made sense because the Royals, they did need some power. But in other ways, it didn't make sense. Here was a team playing on artificial turf, which didn't figure to be very good on Orlando's knees. And it was a team that very much played the speed game. They relied on hitting the ball into the gaps, taking the extra base. The dimensions at Royal Stadium did not favor home run hitters, certainly did not favor Orlando. Now, initially, he did get some playing time. John Mayberry, their other first baseman, got hurt. Orlando got a chance to play, hit well at first, then went into kind of a tailspin, and he did not finish the season very well. He only hit one home run that entire year for the Royals. So at the end of the season, the Royals end up releasing him. And that really brings to an end his long career as a player. So starting in 1975, Orlando is faced with not playing baseball for the first time professionally in about 20 years. And as with many former players, Orlando struggled in his transition to life after the game. In fact, he struggled more than most players because in December of 1975, he's charged with illegal possession of marijuana after officials confiscate a reported 165 pounds of the drug at the San Juan airport. Cepeda and another man were arrested as they were loading the shipment into their cars, which were also confiscated. The marijuana, by the way, was valued at about $66,000. Now, at first, Orlando's defense, his argument with the police was he didn't know about the marijuana. He said that the boxes contained cowhide rugs that he had placed an order for during a recent visit to Colombia. And as it turned out, there were these rugs in the boxes, but the marijuana was in plastic bags attached to the rugs. He said the drugs were not his. He didn't know who planted them. He said they'd been placed by someone else who was trying to set him up. That was his argument. Well, the argument that didn't go over very well. He eventually goes on trial. He's found guilty, sentenced to 5 years in prison. So here we have a guy at one time, a hero in his native Puerto Rico, and now has completely fallen from grace. Some Puerto Ricans called him mafia. They said he was part of the mafia. They felt he was a drug dealer. He received death threats. His family was taunted when they went out in public. I mean, it was really an ugly situation. Starting in 1978, he begins to serve his sentence, and he serves it at a place called Eglin, a minimum security prison in Florida. While at Eglin, he comes out and he admits that his whole story about the marijuana was made up. He admitted that he knew about the marijuana, and he admitted that he'd been using since the 1960s, since his days with the Giants. Now, he did have one quarrel with what the police said. The police said there were 165 pounds of marijuana. Orlando said that wasn't true. He said there was only 5 pounds of marijuana. It doesn't really matter. Either way, what he did was obviously illegal. But he did finally confess that he wasn't being set up. He knew about the marijuana, and he'd been a user for a number of years. Well, he's sentenced to 5 years, but he only ends up serving 10 months. He's let out early because of good behavior. He's really a model citizen at the Eglin prison. So he's able to get out in less than a year. And then really in the early 1980s, this is when we see Orlando start to engineer this personal comeback. One of the things he did was he embraced the teachings of Buddhism. He became a devout Buddhist, really changed a lot of his philosophies on life. He was a guy that had sometimes made excuses for himself, wouldn't admit to failures, and that really changed with his Buddhist practice. He also met a Puerto Rican woman named Midian, M-I-R-I-A-N, Midian, and eventually married her. The couple moved to San Francisco. Then in 1987, while he's in San Francisco, the Giants invite him to take part in a fantasy camp. So Orlando shows up. Giants didn't really know what to expect. Here's a guy who's been in prison, involved with drugs, a lot of problems, but he makes a stirring impression on the organization with the way that he acts at the fantasy camp. He's outgoing, he's friendly, he's approachable. He's like the hit of the fantasy camp. And the Giants were so impressed with what he did that they ended up offering him a job full-time as a team ambassador. So starting in 1987, he's back with the Giants, working this job, making public appearances, delivering speeches, basically making friends whenever he travels throughout the US, Puerto Rico. Just his charismatic, outgoing nature makes him perfect to be a public relations ambassador. Now, all the while, Orlando, because mostly of his drug problems, does not make it to the Hall of Fame. He receives very little support while he's on the ballot for the baseball writers. But then in the 1990s, he is placed on the ballot of the Veterans Committee. And he's considered in 1998, doesn't make it. Then in 1999, he does make it. He does get the 75% of the committee's vote. So he's elected to the Hall by the Vets Committee, and he essentially becomes a regular at Hall of Fame weekend in Cooperstown from that point on. So really an incredible turnaround for him. Again, his Buddhist practices, meeting Midian, working for the Giants, just becomes really a changed person. And just finds a way, a new way to lead his life in a much healthier and more productive fashion. Now, in recent years, Orlando has endured some struggles. Sadly, his wife, Midian, died in 2017. And then his own health really started to suffer. The following year, 2018, he suffered a stroke, resulted in him being hospitalized. At one point, he was in critical condition. Seemed like at one point he might not make it. It was kind of touch and go, but he did recover, and he's actually come back to the Hall of Fame, I think at least twice since then. I was able to see him in Cooperstown in 2022. He was using a wheelchair to help himself get around, and he had, I think his son was with him as well, but he looked really pretty good. He's now 86, and as far as I know, still living in the Bay Area, and a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame, elected as of 1999. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book, and I should mention, this is really a young adult book. It's a book written in a style for teenagers, young adults. It's a relatively short book, 126 pages. But I wanted to appeal to a younger audience because it is this great story of redemption. Here's a guy who had become a pariah in his native land. He was a one-time hero. Fans really turned on him after he made these mistakes with drugs. He was a guy that, kind of lied about it for a while, spent time in prison. He was really kind of at the precipice. And starting in the early 1980s, continuing till today, he's managed to turn his life around. And it's, I think it's a great story. It shows that you can make a comeback. And I think it's a situation where Orlando has kind of found his true self. I mean, he was always a likable guy who got along well with teammates. But he was also someone with this dark side. He did clash with his managers. He did have problems with drugs. And he was really able to slay those demons. And it's kind of nice to see that he's made this remarkable turnaround. So that's my presentation on Orlando Cepeda. I don't know if I can call him a friend. Every time I see him, he knows who I am, and we always say hi. We talk for a few minutes. I mean, I think he's a great guy. He's obviously one of my favorites among the Hall of Famers, and he's always one of the first guys I look for during Hall of Fame weekend, whether it's at the Hall of Fame or during the parade. But I've gotten to know him a little bit, and really glad for him, the way things have turned out for the better since his problems back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody might have for me about Orlando or even about the Hall of Fame. So if you've got a question, let me know.
Bruce, first of all, that was fabulous. If you could take away the share screen.
Sure.
Well, really, that was fabulous. Great insights to Orlando Cepeda. And the book is still available on Amazon, correct?
It is. It's hard to believe I wrote this back in 2001. It's 22 years ago. It doesn't seem like it that long, but the copyright is 2001.
All right, I got one comment and one question.
Sure.
Before we talk about Cepeda, a lot of the guys and gals here love to make the trek up to Cooperstown. Why don't you tell us what you do there?
Sure. I work in the education department. It's one of several departments I've worked in. When I first started at the halls back in '95, I worked in the library, in the research department. Then I moved over to public programs. I did that for a while. I then got a little bit burned out. I ended up leaving the Hall of Fame. Stayed in Cooperstown. My family obviously is here. My wife is originally from the area. Worked at some of the other museums in Cooperstown, the Fenimore Art Museum, the Farmers Museum. And then I had an opportunity to come back to the Hall of Fame in 2013, working in education. And I can say without question that of all the departments I've worked in, education has been my favorite. I get to work with kids, talk to them about baseball. I essentially do kind of what I'm doing tonight. We do virtual programs. We do have school groups that visit the Hall of Fame, and we have somebody else in the department that oversees that. But specifically, I do Zoom programs with students, schools that can't come to Cooperstown. Either it's too far away or it's too expensive to make the bus trip. So we're able to do programs via video conference, virtual field trips, and we can do them with, basically anybody that has an internet connection, and a computer, and a sound system that works. So we've done programs with Eastern schools, Midwestern schools, Pacific Coast schools. We've even done a couple with schools in Latin America, including Venezuela, kids that actually they speak and read English well enough that I can do the program in English. I do speak a little bit of Spanish, but it would be hard for me to teach an hour program in Spanish. It's a lot easier in English. And the programs that we do, we have about 15 different programs. We have civil rights, cultural diversity. We have a math program. We have American history through baseball uniforms, popular culture through baseball cards. We have a program, museum studies, how the Hall of Fame works. What we do is we don't teach baseball just for the sake of baseball, but we use baseball to teach the New York State curriculum. So for example, the story of Jackie Robinson and other Black baseball pioneers, that's what we teach in our civil rights program. In cultural diversity, we talk about Latino players, Asian players, Native American players. In the math program, we teach kids how to calculate batting average using basic math skills, forming a fraction, doing division, rounding. So everything that we do kind of ties baseball into, the normal elementary or high school curriculum. Occasionally we do college groups as well. We also do nursing homes, assisted living facilities. So we do a variety of different programs all through this kind of technology. A lot of people became aware of Zoom during the pandemic. We had been working with Zoom since 2014. We'd actually become very comfortable with it. So we knew a lot about it, what it could do, what it couldn't do, what its limitations were. So Zoom is something that we have now been using for about 10 years. And even before Zoom, we used a different kind of technology to connect to the kids. I think we were one of the first museums in the country to do distance learning programs, late 1990s. We were one of the first. And I remember the first one we did, we had no equipment. We actually had to go to a college an hour away that had video conference technology. We didn't have lesson plans written out. We just brought a few artifacts with us and we sort of ad-libbed it. And now we've developed about 15 different courses. Each one can go an hour or longer, and it covers some of these areas like civil rights, math, science that I mentioned a moment ago. So that's basically what I do. I also host a lot of the virtual programs for the Hall of Fame. Interviewed many people. We do an author series in person from June through August. Dan Taylor, who's joining us now, has been part of our author series the last 2 years. So he's made the long trek to Cooperstown, which has been great. We bring in a number of notable authors. We also do some virtual author series. We just had Lee Lowenfish on. Lee's with us tonight as well. He talked about his new book, Baseball's Endangered Species. So that's kind of all the different things that fall under what I do, my umbrella, working in education at the Hall of Fame.
That's wonderful, Bruce. I wish I was still teaching and we could have hooked you up with my class. My one Cepeda question, I started following baseball in 1969. So the first time I remember Cepeda was with the Braves. And you spoke continuously about his knee issues. And, my question is this, I'm a huge Giant fan, and at Oracle Park, there is a statue of Cepeda. And I can't, for the life of me, understand why the statue is him holding a baseball glove as a fielder. Your comments. I mean, I know you didn't erect the statue, but how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting choice. It's kind of like when you see a baseball card of Lou Brock and he's not running the bases, or you see a baseball card of Brooks Robinson not playing third base. I think there's only one baseball card that was ever produced that had Brooks playing third base, his 1973 card. Yeah, that is an interesting choice. Probably at his best, Orlando was a slightly above average first baseman. He had pretty good hands, limited range because of his knee trouble. Certainly in his later years, it was really hard for him to play first just because of the condition. Both his knees were really bad. I know when I first met Orlando, he had undergone so many surgeries, not only during his career, but post baseball as well. So his knees were, have been a real problem over the course of his life. But yeah, that is an interesting choice that they went with him fielding or with the glove instead of with the bat in his hand, because that's where he did most of his damage.
So if you were the artist, it would have been with the bat, correct?
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. And there's a lot of great photos of him in the middle of his swing, striding toward the pitcher. I mean, if you're an artist looking for, photographic evidence of what Orlando looked like at the plate, he was this, big, strong guy, 6'3", 220 pounds. And generally, was a guy who was in good shape other than his knees. So yeah, I think hitting would have made a lot more sense as opposed for the statue. It's hard to know why they make those decisions. Not sure why.
All right, here's going to be our lineup. We're going to go with Steve, Mars, Bill, Dan, Ed, and Jason. Steve, you're up.
Yes, I have a couple of questions and a couple of points of information. There's also a baseball card I just found out. I probably have it of Jim Cott batting instead of Jim Cott pitching. Same kind of idea that was said before.
Yeah, 1973 Topps card. I think he's with the Queens at that point.
There you go.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was one of those teachers in New York City that took advantage of the program when Pat LaFond was in charge. And I forget the gentleman who replaced her. He was also very good. What happened was
Jeff Arnett.
I'm sorry?
Jeff Arnett.
No, there's somebody else in the
There was someone else?
It'll come to me later.
Okay.
Spring of '97, I took a day off school to go with a couple of friends to Cooperstown to see the Hall of Fame. I've been there so many times, but we just took a day off. It was nice. And we're going through the Hall of Fame and we see a bunch of kids and obviously teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying to myself, what is this all about? And I guess it was Pat LaFond at the time, says we have an educational.
Mm-hmm.
Well, long story short, I did that run 6 times for the next 6 years.
Nice.
I would take a class. We left Washington Heights at 7 o'clock in the morning and got back to Washington Heights at 10 o'clock at night. It's obviously changed. The first time I did it was '97, but some of the things you talked about, the math, the uniforms, priceless, especially for kids with low socioeconomic backgrounds. So if there's any teachers or anybody you guys know that are teachers, it's a wonderful thing and it's not expensive. And I was able to swing a bus and all that stuff and real good. As far as Cepeda is concerned, I taught in one school for 35 years. My principal was there a long time too. When he retired in '02, I retired in '03. He came to me on a day, winter of '02, and said, "This is the last thing I'm going to do for you. That's positive. How would you like to meet Orlando Cepeda?" Mm-hmm. George, what are you talking about? He's having lunch today at a place called Pasta, which, by the way, is his favorite restaurant in New York. I don't know if you ever discussed that with him. He was doing a fundraiser, trying to get a golf tournament, comparing to Marichal off the ground. So I went home first, was on my way, picked up my bio of Cepeda, and had lunch. I sat next to the guy. He was so friendly, signed the book, took a picture. And whenever I've seen him since, my intro is, "Remember Pasta? Oh yeah, Williamsbridge Road." Wonderful guy. I knew about the hiccups on the way, unfortunately, and he did pay some kind of a price, but he was a wonderful guy and made a great comeback, and he's a good asset for the Giants. Thank you for your presentation. I have to cut out soon. Gary, thanks for having me first.
You got it, Steve.
I love your recollections about the education department. Prior to the early 90s, they brought school groups into the Hall of Fame, and they just let them do a self-guided tour of the museum. They kind of let the kids on their own with the teachers, chaperones. They'd go into the gift shop. There was no formal program. And then it was Bill Guilfoyle, who was our public relations director, formerly worked for the Yankees and the Pirates. It was Bill working with Pat LaFond, whom you mentioned, and another guy named Jim Hill. And the three of them really kind of got together and came up with a formal education curriculum and program. And that was about 1992 or 93, and we've been going ever since. So Bill, Pat, Jim Hill were all pioneers in getting that
Is she
started.
still around? Do you ever see her?
Yes, Pat's retired. She lives in Cherry Valley, not far from
That's close.
Cooperstown. Jim Hill also lives in the area. Bill has passed away. He, I want to say, died 6 or 7 years ago. He had dementia. Bill's one of the reasons I worked at the Hall of Fame. I had done kind of an informational interview with him because I was really interested in working at the Hall of Fame. And he said, "Gee, Bruce, we don't really have anything open at the time." And he handed me a Hall of Fame yearbook and he said, "Thanks for coming. And if anything opens up, I'll let you know." And then just before he was kind of going to take me out of the office, he said, "There's somebody I'd like you to meet here. I'm going to take you over to the education department. I'm going to introduce you to Pat LaFond, who heads up education." And he took me over to Pat. And that day, Pat hired me as a teacher. So when you say the names Pat LaFond or Bill Guilfoyle, I really think that's how I got started at the Hall of Fame.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
By the way, Bruce, when I'm looking at you, you look like John Sebastian. I got to tell you that. Mars, you are up.
Oh, well, thank you, Bruce, for joining us. That's very informative. I have a couple of questions and comments. First off, I had the pleasure of sitting down and chatting with Orlando a few times, but the last time was when they premiered the Say Hey Willie Mays movie at the Castro Theater in San Francisco. And when I approached him, I stuck out my hand and said, "Baby Bull, great to see you," and he was very friendly. He was sitting down. He looked like he had gained some weight. But I want to get back to the Alvin Dark episode. Willie Mays, not that he backed Alvin Dark, but because he was, earlier teammates with him, he spoke to Cepeda and the other Latin players to say, "Look, we want to win. So put aside all your ill feelings and let's just try to win." So Willie Mays was the quintessential peacemaker, and always had been, And then there was a part of Cepeda's career while he was still with the Giants. Not only did, as you know, they move him to left, but then they brought in Harvey Keene to play left, and they tried Cepeda in third, where he wasn't quite proficient at that position, and Jim Davenport was the Golden Glove third baseman. I think what the death knell for Cepeda leaving the Giants, although he had the knee problems, and as you say, was a conundrum where you have two great hitters on the team, where to put them. It turned out to be, they considered Cepeda as a complainer and also attitude. And of course, he turned that all around with St. Louis, one most valuable player, and, they also got rid of Philippe Alou, who was a great player, and Gaylord Perry. They happened to make the worst trades. But I would like, if you could tell me that, when did you last speak to Orlando Cepeda, and what was that all about?
As I recall, it was 2 years ago, the 2021. Well, actually, it might have been a year ago. It might have been 2022, that induction. That was a year Tony Oliva, Jim Cott, David Ortiz. I think it was that year. That was July of 2022. I saw him backstage. He was in a wheelchair. He called me over. His son, I think, was with him. And we talked for a few minutes. I asked him how his health was because, we had heard all these reports that things were not going well. But he seemed like he was in good spirits. He said he was feeling good. I'd not seen him in a wheelchair before, so that was a little bit different. I didn't know if he needed the wheelchair for convenience or if he really couldn't walk at all. I didn't want to ask him that. But certainly he remembered me. We talked for 4 or 5 minutes. His mind was clear, sharp. So that was the last time. That was about 1.5 years ago. He did not come to Cooperstown for the induction this year. I don't know the reasons for that, whether it's health related or, he's 86 now. It is probably more difficult for him to travel, especially coming from the West Coast. But when I saw him in 2022 at the induction, he looked pretty good. And he was, like I said, really sharp.
In those years when he was playing with the Giants as well as the Cardinals, I had never seen any other batter that had so much power to right center field. And Willie Mays decided to go that way
great gap
too.
power. He wasn't a strict pull hitter. He could go left center, right center. I've never asked him about this, but I wonder what he would think about all the tendencies that batting coaches have today, teaching the launch angle, the uppercut swing, the pull. Orlando certainly had as I recall, had somewhat of an uppercut swing, and he certainly had home run power, no question. But he was not a strict pull hitter. He could go to the opposite field, as you mentioned.
Well, him and Willie Mays took advantage of the prevailing winds at Candlestick, because hitting a ball to left field would be knocked down. Perhaps even the shortstop could catch it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Mars. Mr. Klink, you are up.
Thank you very much, Gary, and Bruce. Thank you very much. After Juan Marichal, he's my favorite Giant, and he was kind enough in 1991. He was at the A's and Giants were having one of those camps where campers come in and pay lots of money to play with ball players. Well, I didn't do that, but I went to the final day of it, and he was up in the press box, and I can't find the photo of my oldest son and him. It's a beautiful photo. I think it's in a photo montage that for many reasons had to be put into storage temporarily, and that's why I can't find it. But I still have the ball there, if I can get it.
Nice.
He signed a ball to Kevin, and Kevin still remembers that. I wanted to quickly go back to a couple of years. The 1955 season, he went to Salem, Virginia. I spent 2 years in college in Southwestern Virginia, and times had changed, but I know that there was still prejudice in the air. Do you think that had anything to do with his subpar showing? And secondly, why do the Giants do things like that? They send him there. They sent McCovey to Sanderson, Georgia. Why aren't they going to places like Kokomo and St. Cloud to start out? I mean, there they would have had a better launching pad.
That's a great point, and I think you're probably right. I had mentioned that his father had just passed away before the start of that season, so that was a factor. But yeah, I'm sure that the segregation existing in Salem and other towns in the South, that was probably a factor as well. Roberto Clemente talked often about being a double minority. He said, I'm both Black and Latino, and I face racism on both counts. People see me, they see that I'm Black. And then when I speak, I'm speaking with a Spanish accent, and they know that I'm Latino. And so he would face resistance in both areas. And I think it was probably very similar for Orlando, playing in the minor leagues in the 1950s. But you're right. He played better in the northern locations.
Yeah.
It would have made more sense to go there. I just don't think teams looked at it that way. They didn't see it or didn't want to see it. And in retrospect, it's pretty obvious. It's staring right at us, the racism that these guys faced, especially in southern cities where there was segregation. But it was just not something that teams seemed sensitive to. They just ignored it or didn't want to see it. And a lot of Black and Latino players paid the price. it's amazing how many were able to overcome it, like Clemente and Cepeda, not only become major leaguers, but become Hall of Fame players. Really remarkable what they did.
I have occasion to read because one of my fraternity brothers is an enormous Cardinal fan. I get all of his Cardinal magazines, and you probably have read those too. It's a wonderful magazine. I have to say the Cardinals do put out a darn good magazine. He is spoken of so highly and thought of so highly in St. Louis. I think in both the 67 and 68 seasons, he was a true difference maker on that team. And maybe doesn't get the credit that he's due, and he's recognized as a Giant. But boy, I'll tell you, as a Cardinal, I don't know what they would have done in 67 and 68 without him. He was that big a deal.
Yeah,
Obviously,
he was
MVP 1 year.
Yeah, he was really the final piece to the puzzle. They had Julian Javier at second, great second baseman. They had Dal Maxfield, who couldn't hit, but was an excellent shortstop. They had Mike Shannon, who recently passed away, at third. Then they had Brock, Flood. They had Maris and Shannon playing in right field. They had McCarver behind the plate. They didn't have a lot of power in that lineup. And Cepeda kind of filled that bill. You take Cepeda out of that lineup, they're not nearly as strong a team. He was the perfect guy. They needed a first baseman, they needed a power hitter, they needed a cleanup hitter, and he was the person to do all those things for them. There's no way, I think, that they win in 67 and 68, win the pennants and win one World Series without Orlando Cepeda.
And Bob Gibson.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, certainly, yes.
Gibson, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
obviously, yeah. One final one. 73, he paired up. He had a great year. You related to us about being the DH of the year if there had been such a designation. Excuse the pun. That year, but he also paired up with his old friend Marichal. Did he speak of Marichal playing with him in that 73 season? Marichal went 5-1, and he had an awfully good year. They both did well. It wasn't much of a team.
That's a great point. I don't think I asked Orlando about that, about being reunited with Marichal. Certainly, they played for a long time in San Francisco, but I never thought to. I should have brought that up, but I never thought to bring that up with Orlando. As far as I know, they got along well. Marichal is such an easygoing, laid-back guy. For many years, he was too well known for the John Roseboro incident, and as a lot of you probably know, Roseboro went to bat for him when he wasn't getting much support in the Hall of Fame election those first couple of years. Roseboro basically came out and said, hey, he made a mistake. I've forgiven him. If I can forgive him, the writers should be able to forgive him. This guy is worthy of the Hall of Fame. And a lot of people, including me, feel that Roseboro going to bat for Marichal in that way really cleared the way for Marichal to finally get 75% of the vote.
Bob Gibson also spoke highly of him in his election speech and said, my only regret today is that my good friend Juan Marichal isn't standing next to me like he should be. So he laid it right, well, Gibson, he laid it right back on the writers. He let them know that day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill. Bruce, we have about 5 more people who'd like to ask you questions. How are you?
Sure.
You're good?
Yeah, whatever you need.
Perfect. The man with the golden pipes is back. Mr. Taylor, go ahead.
Bruce, it's great to see you. I hope you're doing
Hey,
well.
Dan.
Eve sends her best. And terrific presentation. Thanks for doing it. The thought I've always had, and I'm curious your thoughts on it, is, Cepeda, since playing, has been so associated with the Giants. Do you think there'd be more respect for him in the game if that association was with the Cardinals? And I'm a little surprised that, the Cardinals really didn't embrace him following his playing career. Any thoughts that you have on his relationship with the Cardinal organization?
It's interesting, Dan. I don't know that there's any hard feelings there. All I can think of is that maybe the Cardinals look at it like, well, they only played 3 seasons there, or 2.5. He joined him May of 66, and then he played 67 and 68. And even in 68, his batting average slipped 248, but he hit 43 home runs. Or no, I'm sorry, that's I'm looking at the wrong number. He had 43 walks. He only had 16 home runs, 73 RBIs. In 68, year of the pitcher, those aren't bad numbers. 16 home runs, 73 RBIs. So he had two really good full seasons in St. Louis, all things considered. And as we mentioned a moment ago, there's no way they win the pennants in those 2 years without him. Yeah, I'm not sure why he's not more embraced. The only thing I can think of is it was just the 3 years. Maybe that's it. But he had a huge impact during that time, and I know he was incredibly well liked by the players. Sadly, we're losing a lot of the guys from those great Cardinal teams. Tim McCarver, Mike Shannon, being two of the most recent who have passed away. But yeah, his Cardinal legacy should be better remembered. I agree with you.
Real quick, Perry posted a comment, and I want to jump on it because we see the memorabilia behind you. And if Gary doesn't mind, Bruce, you got to give a shameless plug. You do a really fun podcast series, not about baseball.
Yeah.
I figure
Thanks
that's why
for
Gary
mentioning
had
that,
you
Dan.
booked this
Yeah,
week.
it's a weekly. It's called the Ghostly Gallery Podcast. My other interest, aside from baseball and of course my family, is the genre of horror. I love horror movies, books. I do ghost tours here in Cooperstown. So yeah, we do a weekly show, the Ghostly Gallery Podcast, which is on Podbean. And if any of you are interested in that, give us a listen. We try to have a different guest on each week, and we really get in depth on the subject of horror. It has almost nothing to do with baseball. I'm a weird guy. These are my two interests, baseball and horror. It's hard to figure out, but that's the case. So thanks.
Well, I think horror for a lot of the guys on the call tonight is moves made by the Giants director of baseball operations, but I'll move on to the next question.
Thank you, Dan. Mr. Freer, you were up.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate, I've learned a lot. I just want to clear up something in my mind a little bit. You mentioned he entered the minors in 1953. And then shortly after that, in another year, he had a Triple Crown season. What year was that?
I believe that was 54, playing in the Northern League.
All right. So what I'm driving at is we could have used somebody like him brought up sooner to the Giants. Was there any thought you can speak of? Because I certainly would have liked to see him play in New York back then.
Yeah. Well, you think about it. He was born in what, 37?
I think so, yes.
So, I mean, in 53, he's only what, 16, 17? He's very young. And then he ends up making his major league debut in 58. So he's about 21 or 22. So he probably just wasn't ready at that point.
Yeah.
He also, here was a guy that, had lived in Puerto Rico, had not lived on the US mainland, didn't probably speak much English at that point. So there were some cultural obstacles to be overcome. I think he probably was just not ready.
It wasn't the
yeah.
Giants' decision then, or was it?
No, I just think the Giants felt that, he needed 4 or 5 seasons in the minor leagues. He was a guy who needed a year at maybe each level. Low A, full A, double A, triple A. So he made kind of that gradual progression. It was very different for Clemente. Clemente had been originally signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers. They played him in the minors in Montreal, Brooklyn's top farm team, for a year. And because of the rule at the time, he had received a large bonus. And if you received a bonus of more than $4,000, you had to be put on the major league roster that first year. The Dodgers didn't do that. So they risked losing him in what was kind of the precursor to the Rule 5 draft. And then the Pirates ended up bringing him or signing him or drafting him in that draft. And according to the rules of the Rule 5 draft, If you take a player in that draft, you can't send him to the minors. He has to come right to the major leagues the next season. And if you look at Clemente, his first 4 or 5 years, he struggled. He really could have used extra time in the minor leagues, and he had just the one season. Cepeda had several years in the minor leagues, and then he comes up, wins the Rookie of the Year. So I think in retrospect, the Giants probably gave him the right amount of time. But Clemente, because of the circumstances of the Rule 5 draft, he didn't get the benefit of that minor league apprenticeship, because Clemente didn't really become a star until 1960.
Yeah.
And he had signed, he had made his debut with the Pirates, I believe, in 55.
Though somehow I thought I'd heard that they kind of saved him for San Francisco one time. I don't know if that's true.
Haven't heard that. I can't
Okay.
say it's definitely true or false, but I have not heard that theory.
I just want to make one more comment if I could. I see a resemblance also. Larry King. Has anybody ever said that, especially?
Well, I hope you mean a younger Larry King, right?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
I'll tell you a funny story. A few years back, I was working in the Hall of Fame during the day, and each of the full-time employees had to take a turn standing in the plaque gallery, answering questions from the public. So I'm standing near the entrance to the gallery, and this guy keeps looking at me, staring at me. I'm talking to other people, and I notice he's still staring at me. And then finally he walks up to me and he says, "Are you Steve Carlton?" And I said, "Well, I wish I was, but I'm not." Now, I'm 6'4", I'm pretty tall. Carlton's about 6'7". So I have been confused for lefty on at least one occasion. So
But never Larry King.
no, never Larry King.
All right.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Jason, nice to see you again. You're up.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you guys again. My question will be kind of a two-part, kind of piggybacking off Bill. I'm curious. I grew up in a small town just east of St. Cloud, Minnesota, and just north of Minneapolis. And I'm curious as to what Orlando's experience was in St. Cloud, as well as Minneapolis, and then kind of what his relationship was with Charlie Fox, who was his manager in St. Cloud at the time, if you have any information on that. Thank you.
I don't remember ever bringing that up with Orlando. We didn't talk that much about his minor league days, other than, you know, that first season with Salem and some of the struggles which led to his release.
Okay.
As I recall, he had a good year playing there in St. Cloud.
Mhm.
And I'm sure segregation was a little bit better there than it was in the South, but we never specifically talked to him about that. I don't think Charlie Fox is mentioned in the book. Let me just double check in the index. Of course, Fox became the San Francisco Giants manager late 60s, and by then Orlando had moved on to St. Louis. Well, there is one reference to to Fox, I should say, in the book. See what it says here. So the Giants reacquired Cepeda. They assigned him to their Class C team in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Orlando's new manager, Charlie Fox, gave him a nickname. He called him Plo-Plo, which means fat boy in English. Now, that might sound like an insult, but apparently Fox meant it in a playful way. And then I go on to write that he actually did like Cepeda, even if he was a little bit on the pudgy side. So the nickname, if we use that nickname today, you know, some people might not go for it, but it sounds like Cepeda and Fox had a pretty good relationship.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Ms. Barber, welcome back. Good to see you. Perry, unmute. Perry, unmute, Perry.
Hi.
Hey, Perry.
Oh, my hand is raised. I see. I'm not sure why I'm doing this on my phone tonight. I'm not well versed in mute doing Zooms on my phone. Bruce, wonderful. I learned a lot that, we all think we know so much about the Giants and people like Orlando Cepeda, but it turns out that we don't. So having somebody like you fill in some of the blanks for us is really a treat. So just thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Perry. Perry, of course, has been a terrific umpire for many years. And I got to say, Perry, I'm very disturbed. I keep hearing broadcasters and some of these writers on Twitter, they're talking about the need for mechanical umpire to call balls and strikes. I really hope that that is not going to happen. I don't know if you've heard anything. I know they're doing some of that in the minor leagues, but man, I hope they don't do that in the major leagues. That, to me, that would be a shameful mistake.
Well, I hope so too, but unfortunately, we are regarding it as inevitable and, just having to learn to adjust. So it's going to happen. But I think by the time robot umpires reach the major leagues, it will not be an earpiece whispering ball strike on every pitch to the plate umpire. It will be more of a challenge system whereby teams will have a certain number of challenges for pitches that they regard as critical or crucial. But to me, there's just no replacing the human element, even if it's incorrect. I mean, ball players aren't perfect. Umpires are the only profession where we're expected to be perfect our first day on the job and then get better every day after that.
Yeah.
So we just learn to accept that and live with it and roll with the punches. And thank you for the support. Really appreciate it.
I know the umpires are always a subject of conversation during the postseason. People talk about missed calls, but they still get the vast majority of ball strike calls correct.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're very borderline calls that people, even after seeing it in slow motion, 50% of the audience says it was a strike. The other 50% says it wasn't a strike. I'm not so sure if maybe the technology will exist, but I'm not so sure that the technology is ever going to be so finely tuned that they can judge a three-dimensional strike zone with the way that the ball moves through the zone and then where it ends up in the catcher's mitt.
And that changes with every batter.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
you have to adjust to height and knee height and everything, things like that. So
yeah, they put the box, that rectangular box on the TV screen. Sometimes it's lined up to where the hitter's knees are and below the letters, and other times it's not. So I don't even know how accurate that is. I know people want perfection, but baseball is not a game of perfection. It's
right.
It's a game of human
where
flaws.
Hitting 3 out of 10 times is, really good.
Yeah.
If umpires had that kind of an average, we'd be out on our ears.
Yeah.
So
if they want the real solution, that's to get the better umpires from the minor leagues up.
Exactly.
That's what
exactly. To pick from the pool right at the beginning of an umpire's career to make better choices about who advances through the minor leagues right from the get-go. Yeah, I agree. And that's something that the schools have not been doing. But now that they are opening up the opportunities for women, I think there will be a greater influx of, because, I've been umpiring for 43 years and I don't want to brag on my gender or anything, but there are very few women that I've worked with, and at this point I've worked with a lot of them, who are anything less than excellent all the time. And I've worked with plenty of men that suck, who really have no business being out there on the ball field calling balls and strikes. So that's just my perspective. But yeah, so thank you. Love you, Bruce. You're just fabulous. And yeah, I'm going to listen to your podcast.
Thank you.
So are there no horror movies that have any kind of baseball motif in them that you could recommend?
That's a great question.
2020.
There was a Twilight Zone episode. that featured Jack Warden.
Oh, with the
it was-
goofy guy as the pitcher?
The mighty
Yeah, he was
Casey.
a ro-
Yeah.
was a- he
George
was a
Genovese
robot.
was the third base coach.
Right, yeah.
Casey, Mighty Casey.
And then it wasn't really a horror movie, but there was an awful movie that came out 15, 20 years ago. Wesley Snipes was in it. I think Robert De Niro. It
Oh,
was
yes,
about-
the fan.
Yes, it was about
Right, the
a
fan.
crazy fan
Oh,
who
and
was
there's
obsessed
another
with
one.
a player.
Yeah,
guess you
speaking,
could
have
make
you
an
ever seen,
argument.
have you seen Experiment in Terror?
I have not.
Oh, you should see that. The final scene is set at Candlestick Park, and it's like a, I wouldn't call it horror, but it's a sort of murder suspense type of thing. Really good with, who is the female lead? Not Doris Day.
Lee Remick. Lee Remick.
Lee Remick.
That's it. Thank
Yeah.
you, Lee Remick. Yep.
All right,
yeah,
I'll have to watch
you
that
should
one.
check it out.
Experiment in Terror.
Experiment in Terror.
It always.
When they aired that, when there was a side rear profile of the killer, I texted Eddie Muller and said, "That's Ross Martin." I recognized him even on a side rear profile from the Wild Wild West.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
All right, let's, we got time for two more.
Okay.
Howard and then Lee. Howard, you are up.
Thanks a lot. Hi, Bruce. I just have a question for you. During your presentation, you mentioned something that we all know already, and that is that Cepeda and the other Latino players had a real bad relationship with Al Dark because of some real stupid things Dark said back in '64. But I didn't know that he had negative feelings toward Herman Frank. So I was wondering why. I mean, I know Herman was the manager in '66. Maybe he was the one who forced the trade. Nobody, I live in the East Coast in New York, and none of us, even here in the East, was surprised by that trade because of the way McCovey was playing all the time and not Cepeda. I guess the only thing that surprised us was that the Giants got Ray Sadecki. That was the biggest surprise.
Yeah.
But my question again is, was there a certain incident? Was it that Herman Franks was an old New York Giant coach? Why did he have negative feelings towards Herman Franks, who was close to Willie Mays, as you probably know? But I never knew that Cepeda had any ill will towards Herman Franks.
It certainly wasn't as bad as the relationship with Alvin Dark. I think it was basically two things. Franks put him in left field, which he didn't want to do. And Franks also felt there were times when Orlando didn't hustle. And Orlando obviously, didn't like that. And that was sometimes a charge leveled at Latino ball players, sometimes probably unfairly. So yeah, those were basically the reasons that Orlando and Herman Franks didn't see eye to eye.
Well, you probably know the famous incident in '69 when Gil Hodges pulled Cleon Jones because he thought Cleon Jones wasn't hustling in the outfield. Right. And decades later, that was cleared up by Gil's son, and I think Gil's widow, who recently passed away a couple of years ago, that that's not the way it was at all. But at the time, Gil marched out into the outfield. I guess the grass had been wet, and Cleon was afraid of hurting himself. So he kind of, didn't really hustle after a ball, and he was pulled, and the whole media world went crazy over that. So it sounds to me almost like Herman Franks did that, a couple of years before the famous or the infamous Cleon Jones.
I think in general, Cleon Jones and Gil Hodges did get along. What was so unusual about that was that Hodges actually walked out onto the field himself to either talk to or confront Cleon, and that was unusual. Well, that'd be unusual.
He took him out of the game. He actually took him out of the game.
He took him out of the game.
Cleon walked back to the dugout behind Gil.
When Billy Martin did that to Reggie Jackson, Billy didn't go on the field. He said to Paul Blair, "Go out and take Reggie's place." And then as Blair walked out there, Reggie was like, "What are you doing out here?" And Blair said, "Billy told me to come in for you. You're out of the game." So Billy didn't go on the field the way that Gil Hodges did. And then, of course, Billy and Reggie almost came close in the dugout. Thankfully, Elston Howard and Yogi Berra were there to keep them apart.
Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Sure. Thank you.
I think that's Lee Lowenfish. Let me.
Yeah, I mean,
that is Lee. Go ahead, Lee.
If there are any techies who can tell me what to do on this after the show, do let me know. A quick question about Cepeda and one about you, Bruce. I remember vividly when the Giants moved to San Francisco, Channel 13 brought televised games, select games from St. Louis and Pittsburgh. There was some kind of brawl between Cepeda and the Pirates. As a result, whenever he came up to home plate from then on, he was booed unmercifully. I was wondering if he ever talked to you about it and whether that continued in Pittsburgh when he went to San Francisco. And the quick question about you, Bruce, another great evening, by the way. I saw in your bio that you taught or were on radio in Utica before you came to Cooperstown. Pat Riley probably had left already, but did you ever have any contact with Pat Riley or people who knew him in Utica?
In regards to the first question, I don't remember that incident with the Pirates. I'd have to look in Cepeda's file at the Hall of Fame, and it may very well be referenced there, but I don't remember ever hearing about that and what precipitated it. Never met Pat Riley, never interviewed him. The guy that I did have a chance to interview, well, a couple of guys that I had a chance to interview while working in Utica, Dave Cash, the former Pirates second baseman, part of their World Championship team in 1971. Dave was a terrific athlete in high school in Utica. A lot of talk was that he was going to play basketball at Syracuse, but his grades weren't quite good enough to get in. And he ended up pursuing a baseball career, which ended up being a good choice. And then I've also interviewed, and I know Mark Lemke pretty well. Mark is from Whitesboro, which is one of the surrounding towns near Utica. Mark lives down in Florida and was actually up in Cooperstown for this past induction. He's very close friends with Fred McGriff, who of course was just inducted. So I know Mark pretty well, interviewed him a couple times while I was in Utica, and I interviewed Dave Cash as well. So those were two of the local celebrities. There were some others, but Cash and Lemke definitely come to mind.
And Lemke tried to come back as a pitcher. I'm right, in the independently, right? I mean,
he did. I think he threw a knuckleball for a little bit. Maybe pitched part of one season. Didn't really take to it that well, and then ended up being a longtime broadcaster with the Braves, which is interesting because he was a little bit on the shy side. I mean, he was good to interview. He was always very polite and friendly, but he was kind of naturally shy, and he becomes this longtime broadcaster with the Braves. But now he's retired, and he's probably not that much older than me. He spends a lot of his time, I think, out on the golf course and hanging around with former teammates and players like Fred McGriff. But it was good to see Mark up in Cooperstown in July.
Hey, Lee, it's nice to see you, if I could say that, even though I can't see you. So,
Thank you.
Bruce, do you got time for one more?
One more, sure, absolutely.
All right, Harvey, you're going to wrap it up, Harvey.
Well, actually, Bruce, thank you very much for your presentation, but I just wanted to comment on Lee's comment about the incident in Pittsburgh. My recollection, I watched that on television, was that Orlando bolted out of the Giant dugout with a bat in his hand, and he was subdued by Willie Mays. And
Wow.
Willie wrapped his arms around him and pulled him away from what probably would have been not only the end of his career, but probably his first encounter with the law. I remember that incident pretty well.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up a little bit further to see what exactly precipitated that, because I don't remember uncovering that in his file, but it may be in there somewhere. I'm sure the Sporting News covered it at some point.
I wouldn't be, I haven't looked it up on YouTube, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there isn't a video of it. It was on, as Lee correctly recollected, on Channel 13, which was interesting. It was, I think it was before Channel 13 became a public broadcasting station. It was just a commercial outlet. And that was, I think it was the first, I think that was 1958. I think that was the first year the Giants moved to the coast.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look that one up.
Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bruce, let's all give a round of applause to Bruce Markusen. Bruce, fabulous. Thank you so much for enlightening us more on, these guys love Cepeda and might have learned a lot tonight. So thank you. Gentlemen, we will reconvene next Thursday with Lincoln Mitchell. If anybody wants to hang around a little and talk baseball, we can do that, but I'm going to shut down the recording. And again, Bruce, thank you so much. Fabulous job.
Well,
Good night,
thank you,
everybody.
Gary. I really appreciate it. And
Don't
want
be a
to
stranger,
acknowledge Dan and Perry and Lee and a bunch of other people that I've just met for the first time. But great questions. Thanks for taking the time on a Thursday night to listen to me.
Hey,
Thank you.
Bruce, don't be a stranger. Hop on when you can, okay?
I will.
Bruce-
Thank you.
Bruce, did you see the item I saw online?